Richard Davenport had spent 40 years of his life with Eleanor, never once questioning the woman who had been his partner, lover, and best friend. But when the FBI knocked on his door, everything he thought he knew about her was shattered in an instant. The woman he loved was not who she claimed to be, not even close. Eleanor was a different person entirely, and her past was filled with secrets that threatened to destroy everything. The truth was more dangerous than he could have imagined, and now Richard had to confront the nightmare of his wife's hidden life before it was too late. How do you think Richard's journey of self-discovery and the unraveling of Eleanor's true identity will affect his emotional state and his relationship with those around him? Richard and Eleanor Davenport had spent the last 40 years building a life that seemed perfect in every way. Their home, a modest but charming house in a quiet New England town, was the kind that people admired as they passed by. The white picket fence, the neatly trimmed hedges, and the flower beds that Eleanor tended to every morning painted a picture of stability, warmth, and love. The couple was well known in their community, not for anything extraordinary, but for their kindness. Richard, a retired college professor, had spent decades teaching history at a local university, while Eleanor devoted her time to volunteering at the town's library. They were inseparable, always seen together at community events, farmers' markets, and Sunday church services. To their neighbors, they were a symbol of lasting love, two people who had stood by each other through the trials of life, always smiling, always content. Richard often thought about how lucky he was. At 74, he had a peaceful life with the woman he adored. He would wake up early each morning, pour 2 cups of coffee, and wait for Eleanor to join him at the kitchen table. It had been their routine for years. She would walk in, kiss him on the cheek, and they would sit quietly, sipping their coffee as the morning light filled their cozy kitchen. Eleanor had always been a woman of few words when it came to her past. Richard had met her in the late 1970s, at a small bookstore in Boston. She was younger than him by a few years, reserved but intelligent, with an air of mystery that intrigued him. She never spoke about her family, only mentioning once that she had been an only child and that both her parents had passed away when she was young. She had been alone in the world before meeting him. Richard never pushed her for more details. He believed that some people preferred to leave the past behind, and he respected that. Their life together had been nothing but wonderful. They had traveled across the country, visited Europe twice, and spent long summers in a lakeside cabin in Maine. They never had children, something that Eleanor had always seemed content with, and Richard had never questioned it. Instead, they poured their love into each other, finding fulfillment in the simple joys of life. Eleanor was a creature of habit. She would wake up before sunrise, take long walks around the neighborhood, and spend hours at the library, helping children pick out books. She had a quiet strength about her, a presence that made people feel comfortable. No one ever suspected that there was anything unusual about her. On that particular morning, Richard had no reason to think anything was different. The day had started like any other. He had brewed their coffee and set the mugs on the table, waiting for Eleanor to join him. She came in, smiling as she always did, her silver hair neatly pulled back. Wearing the same light blue cardigan she had owned for years, they sat together drinking their coffee in contented silence, watching the sun rise through the kitchen window. Then, at precisely 8:15 a.m., a loud knock shattered the peaceful morning. Richard glanced at Eleanor, noticing a flicker of something strange in her expression, something he couldn't quite place. She didn't move at first, just stared at the door as if she already knew who was standing on the other side. The knocking came again, louder this time. Richard, confused but unconcerned, stood up and made his way to the front door. When he opened it, he was met with 2 men in dark suits. Their expressions were serious, their presence unsettling. They flashed their badges before speaking, but Richard barely registered their words. His mind was already racing, trying to understand why 2 FBI agents would be standing on his doorstep. "We need to speak with Eleanor Davenport," one of them said. Richard turned to call for his wife, but she was already standing behind him. Her face had lost all its color, her hands trembling at her sides. The agents stepped forward, their eyes locked on her, their expressions unreadable. Then, in a calm but firm voice, one of them spoke again. "Eleanor Davenport, you are under arrest." Richard felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. He stood frozen as the agents pulled out a pair of handcuffs. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched his wife, his Eleanor, slowly raise her hands, not in protest, but in quiet surrender. Neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some stood on their porches, whispering in hushed voices, while others peered through their windows in shock. Richard barely noticed them. His mind was trapped in a whirlwind of confusion, unable to grasp what was happening. The words that followed were like a foreign language to him. False identity, federal fugitive, decades-old crimes. The Eleanor he knew, the woman he had loved for 40 years, had been living a lie. And he had never suspected a thing. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. He had always known Eleanor as the loving, gentle woman who had shared his life for 40 years, the woman who had tended their garden, volunteered at the library, and brought him joy every single day. Yet here she stood, her hands trembling as FBI agents placed cold handcuffs around her wrists. The agents moved quickly, their presence commanding. They didn't seem to care that the whole neighborhood was watching. Richard's neighbors, normally so friendly and respectful, were now standing in silence, their faces painted with disbelief. He felt the weight of their gazes, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from Eleanor. Eleanor, his Eleanor, was not reacting the way he expected. She wasn't protesting. She wasn't shouting her innocence. No, instead, she stood there like a woman who had already known this moment would come. The calmness on her face only deepened Richard's confusion. "Eleanor, what is going on?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper, and it seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. The FBI agents didn't respond. They didn't need to. They simply motioned for Eleanor to step forward, and she did, without hesitation. Richard instinctively reached out, but the agents blocked him. He was trapped in his own home, unable to comprehend what was happening to the woman he had loved for decades. As Eleanor was escorted to the unmarked black car parked in front of their house, Richard's legs gave way, and he slumped against the doorframe. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his voice wouldn't come. The confusion in his mind was overwhelming. One of the agents turned back to Richard as he watched Eleanor being driven away, his expression serious. "You'll get more information at the station, sir, but for now you need to stay here." Richard nodded numbly, but he didn't know what he was agreeing to. The agent's words barely registered. He was too focused on the sight of Eleanor being taken from him, his wife, his partner, the woman who had been his world for so long. He stumbled back into the house, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions. His thoughts darted between disbelief and anger. How could Eleanor have been hiding something so significant from him? For 40 years, they had built a life together, shared everything. At least he thought they had. Yet, in an instant, his world had shattered. What had she been hiding all this time? Who had she really been? Richard's hands shook as he reached for his phone, dialing the only number he could think of. His best friend, Henry. He needed someone to talk to, someone who could help him make sense of the chaos. Henry answered on the second ring. "Richard, what's going on? I heard sirens. Are you all right?" Richard's voice cracked as he spoke, barely able to get the words out. "Henry, they took her. The FBI. They arrested Eleanor." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Richard could feel Henry's confusion and concern. "What do you mean they arrested her? For what?" "I don't know," Richard replied, his voice trembling. "They didn't tell me anything. They just said she's been living under a false identity, that she's some kind of federal fugitive." Henry's tone shifted to one of disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about? Eleanor? She's been with you for decades. She's always been there. How could she—" "I don't know," Richard interrupted, his voice rising in frustration. "I don't know, but I'm telling you, Henry, this doesn't make sense. She's been lying to me, lying to everyone. I don't know who she really is." Henry's voice softened. "All right, Richard, just stay calm. We'll figure this out. You need to go to the station. They'll tell you what's going on." Richard ended the call and sat in silence for a moment, trying to steady his thoughts. He looked around the house, at the photos on the walls, their wedding picture, the photos of vacations they had taken together, even the candid snapshots from their quiet evenings at home. All of it suddenly felt hollow, as if it had been built on a foundation of lies. He was angry, but there was something else too. Fear. Fear of the woman he had shared his life with, the woman he thought he knew, being someone entirely different from the person he had spent 4 decades loving. Richard didn't know what to do next, but he couldn't just sit here. He had to know what was going on. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his mind still racing. The FBI's words echoed in his ears. Federal fugitive, false identity, decades-old crimes. The drive to the station felt like an eternity. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His thoughts were a blur, his emotions a mixture of confusion, anger, and dread. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he had to know the truth. When he arrived at the station, he was directed to a small, sterile room. It smelled faintly of coffee and bleach, and the walls seemed to close in around him. A few minutes later, an agent entered the room. His face was stern, but there was a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "I'm Agent Murphy," he said, sitting across from Richard. "I know this is hard to understand, but I'm here to explain what's going on." Richard nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead, thinking of Eleanor. What had she been hiding? What had she done? "Your wife," Agent Murphy began, "has been living under a false identity for years. She's been on the FBI's most wanted list for a long time. Her real name isn't Eleanor Davenport." Richard's heart dropped into his stomach. What do you mean?" "She's Margaret Sinclair," Agent Murphy continued. "A fugitive involved in a bombing decades ago. She's been living off the grid ever since, using your name, your life, to hide from the law." Richard's breath caught in his chest. Margaret Sinclair. The name meant nothing to him, but to the FBI, it meant everything. His wife, the woman he trusted, had been running from a past he never knew existed. Richard's world was falling apart. The name Margaret Sinclair echoed in his mind, a name he had never heard before. Eleanor, the woman he had loved, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone, wasn't even Eleanor. She was a fugitive, someone with a past so dark it had been hidden from him for 4 decades. His hands trembled as he sat across from Agent Murphy, trying to process the revelation. Every part of him screamed that this couldn't be true, but the evidence, the cold reality of it all, was undeniable. Margaret Sinclair was part of a radical group in the 1970s, Agent Murphy continued, his voice steady but firm. The group was responsible for a bombing that killed several people. Sinclair was implicated, but she vanished before she could be arrested. She's been living under various aliases ever since, and for the last few years she's been using your name. Richard shook his head, trying to grasp the enormity of the situation. The woman he had married, the woman he had shared everything with, had been living a lie for all those years. He thought of their life together, the quiet moments, the shared holidays, the trips they had taken, and everything felt like a facade now. "I don't understand," Richard whispered. How could she hide something like this from me? How could she keep it from me for so long?" Agent Murphy's expression softened, but his tone remained firm. "She was very good at covering her tracks, Mr. Davenport. People like her, people who live on the run, are often careful. She built a life with you because she knew you were a safe target, someone who wouldn't question her past, someone who wouldn't pry, but she wasn't who you thought she was. She's been running from a past she couldn't escape, and you were just another part of her disguise." Richard felt the weight of Murphy's words like a crushing force on his chest. He had trusted Eleanor, Margaret, completely. How could he have been so blind? The woman he had loved for 40 years, the woman he had built his life around, was a fugitive, and he had never suspected a thing. His mind raced with questions. Had he ever really known her? Had their entire relationship been nothing more than a lie? The realization was like a knife to the heart, and he fought back tears, his emotions swirling in a turbulent storm of betrayal and confusion. "I don't understand," Richard repeated, his voice shaky. "Why did she stay with me all these years? Why not just leave? Why didn't she tell me the truth?" Agent Murphy leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Richard. "That's the thing, Mr. Davenport. People like Margaret Sinclair don't just leave. They don't trust anyone. They need to blend in, to stay hidden, and to do that, they have to create a life that looks real, looks normal. You were a part of that life. You were a way for her to stay under the radar, to escape detection. She couldn't afford to tell you the truth, because it would have exposed her, made her a target." Richard let out a bitter laugh, a sound that didn't feel like it came from him. "So, all these years, I was just a means to an end. Just a way for her to hide." "That's not exactly what I'm saying," Agent Murphy replied carefully. "But yes, she used your life, your reputation, to stay off the radar, and she did it very well." Richard ran his hands through his hair, trying to make sense of the mess. He thought back to all the times Eleanor had seemed distant, all the times she had avoided certain subjects, never talked about her past. He had chalked it up to personal boundaries, to things she just didn't want to revisit. But now those boundaries seemed like deliberate walls she had built to keep him out of her real life. And now it felt like his whole world had been turned upside down. He thought about the small things, the little details that he had never questioned. The way Eleanor had never really had any family, the way she had always kept her childhood to herself, never offering any pictures or memories of her parents, the way she had always been so careful about where she went and who she talked to. He had seen all these things but had never connected the dots. Agent Murphy was watching him, giving him space to absorb the gravity of the situation. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice low and hoarse. "What happens now? What happens to her?" "She'll be taken into custody, processed, and eventually stand trial for her role in the bombing," Agent Murphy said. "We've been tracking her for years, and when we finally traced her to you, we moved in. We'll continue our investigation, and we'll make sure she faces the consequences of her actions." Richard nodded, though it didn't feel like he was fully hearing what the agent was saying. His mind was still racing, unable to escape the images of his life with Eleanor, the trips they had taken, the anniversaries they had celebrated, the quiet evenings they had spent together. All of it now seemed like a lie. He felt a wave of nausea, the reality of everything crashing down on him. Was he just a fool? Had he been so blind to the woman he loved? How could he have missed it? How could she have deceived him for so long? "Mr. Davenport, I understand this is hard," Agent Murphy said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you need to understand that your wife, Margaret Sinclair, has been living a double life for a very long time. This wasn't something she could just walk away from. And you, unfortunately, were caught up in it. You were the key to her disguise." Richard looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. "I don't even know who she is anymore. I know this is a lot to take in, but we're going to help you understand. We'll get you the information you need. But you need to stay strong, Mr. Davenport. This isn't just about your wife, it's about justice for the victims of the bombing." The words, "victims of the bombing," hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He had thought Eleanor was a woman who had never hurt anyone, a woman who was kind and caring. But now he learned that she had been part of something horrific. Richard closed his eyes, trying to shut out the flood of emotions. He had spent his life loving a woman who was now nothing more than a criminal, someone who had hidden her true nature from him for all those years. He didn't know where to go from here or what to feel anymore. All he knew was that the woman he had trusted, the woman he had spent his life with, had turned out to be someone else entirely. The days that followed were a blur of emotions and confusion for Richard. He could barely process the events as they unfolded around him. The woman he had spent 4 decades of his life with, the one he had trusted implicitly, was a stranger. Every detail of their life together now felt like a carefully constructed lie, and the pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His friends and family, when they heard the news, were equally shocked. They couldn't understand how Eleanor, now Margaret Sinclair, had kept up the facade for so long. Richard spent hours trying to recall every moment, every gesture, trying to piece together a version of Eleanor that matched the one he had known. But the more he thought about it, the more the truth seemed to slip through his fingers. He went through their old photographs, looking for something, anything, that might have revealed her true identity, but there was nothing. It was as if Eleanor had always been who she claimed to be. How had she managed it for so long? How had she convinced everyone around her that she was someone else entirely? The FBI had promised to give him more information, but the more he pushed, the more they clammed up. He couldn't understand why they were withholding details from him. The agents had been polite, but they didn't seem interested in comforting him. They just wanted to process Eleanor, Margaret, and move on. Richard was left alone in a world that no longer made sense, with 1,000 questions he couldn't get answers to. The first few nights after Eleanor's arrest were the hardest. The house felt empty, the silence more oppressive than he could have imagined. There were no more soft footsteps in the kitchen, no more gentle laughter echoing through the halls. Everything he had taken for granted was gone. The quiet comfort of their life together had evaporated, and Richard was left alone with the haunting realization that he had been living with a stranger. He tried to call her, of course. He wanted answers. He deserved answers. But all his calls were ignored. The FBI had made it clear that she wouldn't be speaking to anyone without a lawyer present, and Richard's calls were just another reminder of how far apart they had become. The grief was overwhelming, and Richard found himself pacing around their house in the dark hours of the night, unable to sleep. It wasn't just the betrayal he felt. It was the complete loss of everything he had believed in. His whole life had been built on the assumption that Eleanor was someone she wasn't. And now he was left with the ruins of that life, unable to make sense of anything. On the 4th day after Eleanor's arrest, Richard finally got a call from the FBI. It was a different agent this time, one who had not been involved in the initial investigation, but who claimed to have more information. For Richard, the agent introduced himself as Special Agent Raymond Grant and told Richard he needed to meet with him in person. Richard agreed to the meeting, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what had happened. He needed to know why Eleanor Margaret had chosen him. When he arrived at the FBI office, Agent Grant led him into a small conference room. The agent was calm and collected, his demeanor professional, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of empathy maybe, or perhaps pity. "Mr. Davenport," Agent Grant began, "I know this is difficult for you, but I need to give you some more information about your wife's past. There are things you need to know." Richard nodded, barely able to meet the agent's eyes. "Please, just tell me the truth. I don't know how much more of this I can take." Agent Grant gave him a sympathetic look before continuing. "We've been investigating Margaret Sinclair for years. She was involved in a bombing in the 1970s, but that's not all. Before that, she was part of a network of radicals who were responsible for a series of violent protests and attacks across the country. Her name was well known in certain circles, but she managed to disappear after the bombing. We have reason to believe that she's been involved in several other incidents since then, though she's always managed to stay one step ahead of us." Richard sat back in his chair, his mind struggling to keep up. "But why didn't she ever tell me? Why did she keep all of this from me?" Agent Grant sighed, leaning forward slightly. "Because, Mr. Davenport, that's what people like Margaret do. They hide. They build lives under false identities. They trust no one. They don't allow themselves to get close to anyone because they know they can never escape their past unless they stay hidden. She stayed with you because you were a way for her to maintain that illusion of a normal life." Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't the woman he had married. This wasn't the woman who had held him at night, the one who had made him laugh, the one who had shared all of his dreams. No, this was someone else entirely, someone with a past that was too dark to even comprehend. "Did she ever care about me?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Agent Grant hesitated before answering. "It's difficult to say. People like Margaret often form attachments, but it's usually in a way that suits their needs. It's a survival mechanism. She may have cared for you, but her primary concern was always her own safety, her own escape. You were part of that escape, and she needed you to keep her hidden. That doesn't mean she didn't care about you, it just means that her priorities were always different from yours." Richard sat in silence, trying to process the agent's words. He had loved Eleanor so deeply, had believed in her so completely, and now he was hearing that everything he thought he knew about her was a lie. The life they had shared had been a carefully orchestrated performance, one that had been staged to keep her safe from the authorities. "What now?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. Agent Grant leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "Now we move forward, we'll continue the investigation, and we'll bring her to justice. But you need to understand, Mr. Davenport, that the woman you knew is gone. The person you married, Eleanor, never existed. Margaret Sinclair has been living in the shadows for a long time, and she won't be going back to her old life." Richard nodded slowly, his heart heavy with grief. The woman he had loved was gone. The life he had built with her was gone. All that remained was the cold, painful truth. And as he left the FBI office, Richard knew that he would never be able to look at his past the same way again. Weeks had passed since Richard's meeting with Special Agent Grant, and the painful truth about Eleanor, or rather Margaret Sinclair, had settled like a weight on his chest. Every day felt like he was walking through a fog, each step heavier than the last. The house they had shared, once a place of warmth and comfort, now seemed foreign. The laughter, the quiet moments, the everyday life he had taken for granted, it all felt like a distant memory. The woman he had known, the woman he had loved for 40 years, had never truly existed. Richard had spent the last several weeks attempting to piece together the shattered fragments of his life. He had spoken with his lawyer, trying to understand what, if anything, he could do. The authorities had been clear. Margaret was a criminal, and her past would catch up with her eventually. They had assured him that he was in no way involved in her crimes, but the reality of it all still weighed heavily on him. How could he have missed everything? How could he not have seen the signs? The questions gnawed at him, but there were no answers, only the bitter sting of betrayal. His friends and family, while sympathetic, couldn't fully understand what he was going through. They tried to offer their support, but the truth was, no one could relate to the agony of loving someone for so long, only to learn they had been living a life of lies. His world had been turned upside down, and all the years of shared memories felt like nothing more than a mirage. And then, just when Richard thought he could not endure any more, there was another phone call from the FBI. This time, it wasn't just Agent Grant. It was a woman's voice on the other end, calm but insistent. "Mr. Davenport," she said, "we need you to come in. We've found something. It's about Margaret." Richard's heart sank. He had thought he had heard it all, that there could be nothing left to uncover about his wife's past that would surprise him. But the FBI's cryptic message sent a chill down his spine. He agreed to meet them, his mind racing with dread and curiosity. When Richard entered the FBI office, Agent Grant and a new agent, Agent Wallace, were waiting for him. They led him into a conference room, where files and photographs were spread out on the table. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with tension. "Mr. Davenport," Agent Wallace began, "we've been continuing our investigation into Margaret Sinclair's past, and we've uncovered something that might explain her actions." Richard braced himself, knowing that whatever they were about to reveal could shatter him even more. "We discovered that before she became involved in radical groups in the 1970s," Agent Wallace continued, Margaret was part of a much larger operation, an underground network that spanned several countries. She was trained as an operative, someone skilled in evasion, manipulation, and deception. She wasn't just an activist or a protester, she was a trained professional. And it seems that her ties to these groups didn't end with the bombing. Richard listened in stunned silence. His mind struggled to keep up with the new information. Margaret had never told him anything about her past, but this was something he could never have imagined. He had always believed she was simply a quiet, reserved woman, a partner who had never revealed too much about herself. But this was something else entirely. She was more than just a fugitive, Agent Grant added. She was an asset, someone with specific skills that made her invaluable to those who were hiding her. Over the years, she used her ability to blend in, to manipulate situations to her advantage. But it wasn't until she met you, Mr. Davenport, that she found the perfect cover. Richard felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His mind was racing, but it seemed impossible to keep up with the reality of what was being laid out before him. The woman he had married had been part of something far more sinister than he could ever have imagined. She had been living a double life for years, using him as a shield to protect herself from the consequences of her past. "Why are you telling me this?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. "What does this mean for me? What do I do with all of this?" Agent. Wallace exchanged a glance with Agent Grant before responding. "We're telling you this because, Mr. Davenport, you need to understand the full extent of what Margaret was involved in. She wasn't just a woman with a dark past. She was part of a global network that is still active, and we need you to help us understand how deep her involvement was." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what they were asking of him. How could he possibly help them uncover the truth? He was just a man who had been deceived by the woman he loved. "We don't expect you to have all the answers," Agent Grant continued, his tone softer now. "But we need to know what you can remember, anything that might shed light on her behavior, her contacts, or the places she frequented. Anything that could help us bring the larger network to justice." Richard sat there in stunned silence, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He felt as though his whole life had been ripped apart, and now he was being asked to help in a way that felt impossible. How could he possibly contribute to an investigation that was so far beyond his understanding? But then, something inside of him shifted. The anger and betrayal that had consumed him for weeks began to settle into something else. He realized that he had spent so much time focusing on his own pain, his own heartbreak, that he hadn't truly understood the full scope of what had happened. Margaret had used him, yes, but she had also dragged him into something much larger than he could have ever imagined. And if there was one thing he knew now, it was that he couldn't just sit back and let it all slip away. "I'll help," Richard said, his voice steady, though his heart was still in turmoil. "I'll do whatever I can. Just tell me what you need." Agent Grant and Agent Wallace nodded, a slight sense of relief passing between them. For the first time in weeks, Richard felt a sense of purpose. He didn't know how much he could offer, or if it would even matter in the grand scheme of things. But he knew that he couldn't allow the rest of his life to be defined by the lies that had been told to him. Margaret Sinclair, Eleanor, had used him, manipulated him, but in the end, he was still a man with his own choices. And now it seemed his journey would be about more than just moving on from a broken past. It would be about confronting the truth, piece by piece, and trying to make sense of a life that had been shattered beyond recognition.